back again.
Yes, we are.
James Lee McFarland here, the tailor.
And Victoria Baylor, professional dressmaker.
Well, you know something? I'm glad to see you again.
Thank you, thank you. It's a pleasure to be seen, and of course by you guys as well. What are we talking about today, Mr. Jim?
Well, you know something? A catchy phrase came out and we started calling it the what? The training wheels of sewing.
Yeah.
Why we call it the training wheels?
Well, it's interesting. I thought that was a really cool. We had, collaborations are good. We got to chit-chatting the other day and we thought about it. Sewing training wheels had a nice ring to it. And we call it that because just like when you're going to actually perform or learn how to ride a bike, sometimes you need those intermediate steps that help you get there. It's very rare sometimes people can jump on a bike and just take off.
I'm here to
might
tell
need
you.
might need a little extra assistance. Well, I think the same is true in sewing. Sometimes, we expect people to sew straight, we expect them to do all this stuff, and it's great, and you can, but there are functions in sewing where you need that extra little step before you can do the next step, hands-free or training wheels-free, so to speak.
I used to ride down the street, throw up my hands, throw up my feet on my bicycle.
Yeah, we had a daredevil here.
Right. When I got into sewing, though, I had to learn certain steps, certain things that prepared me to go on further. The tips that we're going to give you, the training wheels that we're going to show you, should help you get to that step a little easier. Now, some of you might not need it, but then there are those that will need it.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, those stair-step kind of techniques, we also have just all in all good techniques that you can use. So some of the stuff is like, training wheels, and the other ones are just really quick, easy little tips and techniques. I think most people
Very
can
easy,
use.
very
Yeah.
easy, and simple. A lot of people think, oh, it's so complicated. Well, it's not.
Nope.
Some of these tips that you're going to get, some of these methods that we're going to show you are simpler than what you think.
That's right. And I always love, he always say, the end should justify the means. And sometimes, why go from step A through Z where you can just go, A to B and get it done?
That's it.
That's right. Let's make it
That's
simple.
it.
So we dedicate this to all you guys out there trying to sew better, faster, all that good stuff. We hope you find our inspirational tips helpful and enjoyable. So let's go ahead and show you what those are.
All right.
All right.
Thank you very much. All right. Now, darts. People put darts in different ways. And a dart is placed to give shape to a garment. Now, I'm going to show you the way most patterns are drawn up, and I'm going to show you the way I do it. Now, a lot of times I get asked, how long should a dart be? Generally, they're anywhere from 3 to 3.5 inches. Most patterns, as you know, are shaped where it looks like this. Now, this little extra piece, a lot of times I've seen people cut it off. Well, let's not cut it off, because that's there for a purpose, so that when you do a garment, if you don't have it, you get a little dimple in there where it's done. We don't want that. Now, most of the time, you'll see a dart, and it's put on the pattern like this. And I'm going to show you what the biggest challenge that everybody has. That's normally the way it's put in. In turn, this center line is very crucial in a dart. I only mark one side. Now I'm going to tell you why. Too many of you guys spend too much time stitching, hoping this stitch matches this side. That's not important. What's important is this center line here. If you only do one side, you don't have to worry about the second side. Wherever the angle is angled off, like so, if you follow that one line, this side will automatically parallel with this side right here. But when you do both of them, too many people tell me they try and line this side up with that. I don't. Just do one side. You have to bring the dart down. You want to make sure that your center of your dart is folded in half, and this is what you're looking at. That angle right there. That's all you need. If you put both of them, you're going to spend too much time trying to match this side up with that. That's my simple method of making a dart.
So my dart marking technique is pretty straightforward. I know Mr. Jim showed you and kind of gave you the background and ins and out of adding darts. This is a real simple method for me. So I didn't have a pattern handy, so I just drew a simulation of a dart on a piece of paper. Mind you, if this was actually on a pattern piece, it would have its little crowning head here. Of course, that would be cut into the fabric. But all I'm concerned about showing you right now is actually just where the dart legs are and where they intersect at the point. And essentially how I transfer a dart for most fabrics. Now, mind you, it has to be either a tightly woven fabric, something that doesn't ravel or unravel very easily. But for this, it's really simple. I just place it, of course, the pattern piece wherever it needs to be oriented. And a transfer to dart is like 2 quick steps or 3 steps. I nip where my dart legs are. So I'll go on my fabric. Now these are my really great shears. I will not be cutting this piece of paper with them. These are my micro tips. So I'm just gonna kind of go underneath and mark. I will nip wherever that leg is. Do a quick clip. And it's probably about 1/8 of an inch in, just so I know where it's at. Maybe a little longer than that. But anyway, just so I know where it's at, and then without moving it, so of course I would more than likely have pattern weights and such on here. I will, oh, we just had something fall, so excuse that noise. I will add the pin to pinpoint exactly where the point is on my dart. Mark that with the marker and such, and if it's 2 layers, I will go between the fabric and mark and then pull that out, and then here we go, we have it. There's 2 little nips for the legs and then the mark for the pattern piece. When I go to actually sew this, I will actually connect the legs, so just take where the marks are with there, see those 2 marks, put those together, hold this, and then put that dot on the fold, so as you can see right there. So now I know to sew from where the nip is all the way down to where that connecting point is. So that's how I do my darts. It's really easy. Okay, in this section we're covering some techniques to ensure that you put those zippers in straight. A lot of students, or a lot of sewers in general, actually have problems with this. So one of our suggestions and tips is, why not use a guideline? I mean, guidelines aren't bad, right? In a sense, they're kind of like a training wheel for sewing in zippers. So one of the guidelines I have is real short and sweet, but it's really effective, is consider using your serged edge as a guideline for inputting your invisible zipper. So of course, if you're adding this into pants, the back of a top, anything like that, we always finish off our edges. Well, if you're going to use a serged edge, it actually has a dual kind of sense of usefulness, I discovered. It just so happens to be wide enough that you can use it, and when it's combined with that of your standard invisible zipper, you actually end up with about a 5/8 inch edge for where you have to sew from the edge to the zipper itself. So you can either you can always, of course, double check it by using your standard ruler, of course. So here, make sure it's pressed up against that, and I'm trying to manipulate it with 2 hands, so we'll push it down. Normally with the conventional sewing machine, the way the feet are set up, it's easier sometimes to sew an invisible zipper. I actually sew those without pressing or ironing. I never have to, but it's just the way my feet are made. I'm told from Mr. Jim that I have an industrial as well, but I don't sew my invisible zippers on it. But the invisible zippers foots for industrial machines are a tad bit narrower, so it works a little bit better to actually press those down, which is true. So anyhow, so we're going to put this down flat, or at least for right here for demonstration purpose, and push the ruler there, and you can see it's about 5/8 from the edge. So this is actually how I put mines in, so I never have a problem really putting in invisible zippers and keeping those straight. So this is my little tip, and hopefully you'll find it helpful.
Now, setting in a zipper, on a flat zipper, I always use a 3/4 inch seam allowance on zipper carriages. I do that on all of mine so that I know I have enough catch on the back. Now, most zippers used to be set in to where you had half the zipper on each side of the teeth. But what used to happen is that it peeled open a little and you would see the teeth. I now overlap the teeth totally so that when I put the other side down, you don't see the teeth. Now, I started a new method in my teaching with my students so that they would get comfortable where the zipper goes. Now, what I do now is I now mark 1/4 inch all the way up, because 1/4 inch seam will cover, and it will cover where the zipper goes. So then I have them baste, because I use the basting technique. I have them baste the zipper on that 1/4 inch line. This way I know it's set in straight, because if they put the zipper down on the 1/4 inch line, they won't go wrong, and baste it in. Now, as you can see here, the reason why I use a 3/4 inch seam on all my zipper, you can see the edge to make sure that they catch the zipper. Then once they do that, now I'm having them on this side, which comes back to straight stitching, draw another line. Now, we use these pilot pens, which has the disappearing ink after a while, and now I have them draw the line too. I don't want any excuses on why they can't stitch that zipper in straight. So now they have a stitch line. Now, I got a lot of them that I fuss at because I draw a line and they go off the line. How you gonna miss the line? Now that's your stitch line right there. So once that zipper is basted in on this side, this is before I put that top stitch on. Once it's basted in on this side, and I close the zipper up. Now here's a problem that a lot of people have. Move the slide bar out of your way, either stitching it or basting it. Just move it out the way. Because they'll get too close to the slide bar, and all of a sudden it becomes a bump there, or they take the needle up and they don't put it back down, and they get a little space gap. So once this is set in on one side, say that 1/4 inch stitch will cover the zipper totally. Then the mere fact of just moving this in, and then you lay this side down, because what you do is you stitch down, you cross over at the opening, and you come back up. This side, right here, if this is the distance here between where this crossed over, this same distance needs to be all the way up on your zipper. If you move it out too far, you get an opening. If you move it in too close, you get a lap over. That's the way I do my zippers, but I'm starting to put more marks on there. Remember, the 1/4 inch of where we set it on, showing, knowing that that 1/4 inch covers the zipper. Then the other mark is the stitch line. If you're going to stitch it in a 1/2 inch, make your 1/2 inch line all the way down. That's the method that I use. All right, guys, I get a lot of questions on how I do mine. Most people just pin the pattern to the fabric. I pin it first, and then I trace the outline of it. And this is a twofold, because the other day one of my students had one of these multiple patterns, and she was cutting down in size. She was cutting down in size. So she didn't want to cut the pattern piece off. So I told her, trace it out, like you see I'm doing here, Then I have a trace outline. Now, I'm going to say cut this down. This pattern ranged from 6 to 14. Now I want to cut it down to a 10. I'm going to show you how we do that if it's traced. Now this was already folded. I folded the square edge down to the 10. So I know that's there. I want to shift this in to the 10. If you trace it down, when you remove your pattern piece, I have an outline of where it is. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to where the 10 is, and I'm going to lay the pattern piece now down like that, and I'm going to trace out where the 10 cutout is. So this is going to be cut away. Now I'm going to go here and do the same thing. Notice how I use the edge. Now you can't really do that accurate if you're trying to maneuver it with the pattern piece on it. So now I have the old mark and the new mark. Now one of the other benefits of tracing, I put a few pins to hold that back down, is that a lot of times when you're cutting, the pattern piece will move on you. So you don't get quite as accurate a cut. But when you trace it out, you get a more accurate cut because you see exactly where the line is. When you're manipulating the pattern piece, sometimes you cut, the scissors get hung up, the pattern moves like that, the pattern shifts this way, the pattern shifts that way, unless you put 1,000 pins on it. You guys know I do not like pins. So now I can clearly cut the size that I want. The adjustment that I want and all. Now, there is a Scotch tape method that I use when garments have a very loose edge. That method is to take the tape, put it on the edge, my cut edge, and then cut through it. Now, what happens? Very simple. The tape holds all this frayed edge down without it doing this. Now, granted, it is only on one side, so let's be real about that. You can take it's better to serge this so that it doesn't come loose. But if you use the tape and you cut right through it, like I put it on the edge, you hold the top side down till you get everything secured. It's mainly securing it so that it doesn't fray. But I always, like I say, I always outline mine without having the pattern on it and trying to take my shears and do it. And this is what happens. Okay? All of this happens when you're cutting it. See how the pattern flipped up? If you got your outline, no problem. That's the way I do mine.
Okay, when it comes to cutting out anything, of course, sewing related, any kind of garment piece, pattern piece, I am a bit of a stickler, I must admit. And my preferred method is actually by a rotary cutter. So yes, I use the sewing pizza slicer, as I like to call. And I'll just demonstrate how I use that. This, of course, is your standard rotary mat. So it's rotary cutter mat. And then this is the blade, it's a 45 millimeter blade. They come, of course, in different sizes, as most of you know, so I use a bigger plate with bigger pieces. But for this demonstration, I have two fabrics here. They're both knits. And I'm going to cut out both layers at one time. Oftentimes I do not do that, but for the sake of this demonstration, I do, or I am. I've done a few gowns in the last few months that consisted of double layers. So they either had a base fabric and then like a lace overlay or something like that. And in these cases, which is what I'm trying to demonstrate, I definitely consider having really good cutting methodology in place. I mean, obviously it's important across the board. Whenever you don't cut something correctly, think about it. Every other operation downstream is pretty much a blip. So if you don't cut out your pattern pieces right, they won't sew together correctly. And there's nothing worse than that feeling. So here is my pattern piece. I just grabbed one, of course, it's a bodice piece and it's supposed to be on the fold, but this is a demo, so we don't have to follow that rule. But essentially, I just want to show you how I do this. This is a big old clapper. I normally use canned goods for weights, which is kind of funny. I like them. They're heavy. They don't shift when you're touching your fabric. If you accidentally bump something, I really like them for that reason. The only caution I will have that is that if you use a very delicate fabric, be careful with putting any kind of weight like that on it, because sometimes it will leave an impression. But for this, we're just going to cut this out. So again, I use a rotary cutter, and then I'm going to stand up. Hopefully I don't get in the way of the camera too much. And most people will tell you when you use these to actually, you're supposed to push the blade. That does not work for me. Or I'm sorry, you're supposed to pull it towards you. I'm the opposite. It doesn't work very well for me that way. I actually push your blade. I don't think it really matters, but just FYI. And essentially, you just go around and cut this thing out. And I'm going to try not to get in the way of, and I might have said that backwards. I pull the blade toward me where, that's right, other people push it. So essentially, and see, there's very minimal shifting that actually happens when cutting out. And I'm trying to do this from the side, so it'll be very accurate. I'm going to move my clapper up and then just kind of give it a good piece of, I'm not touching my pattern in any way. And it does take a little bit, I nipped it right there by accident, but it does take a little bit of time to kind of get used to handling a cutter. But once you do, you'll find that the accuracy is actually, I mean, it's great. And for some people, of course, like Mr. Jim, who is super skilled at wielding his scissors, for me, I always have a problem when I lower it and then I have to shift it and move it. And again, I'm just very anal about that. So I find that the rotary cutter works better for me. So I'm going to cut this out and then show you some basting tips. Okay, so I just finished cutting out the entire pattern piece using, of course, my rotary cutter. And as you can see, before I even peel back the pattern piece, look at just the edges. See how everything is properly aligned? I guess I shifted that a little bit. It's a knit. But see how you can't see any pieces of fabric poking out from the outer edges of the pattern, and it's all aligned very well. And it looks very crisp. I didn't cut through anything or anything weird happened. And then if I pull it to the side like that, you can see that this actually looks like a well-cut, piece of material, and it definitely mirrors the actual pattern piece. So of course, as I mentioned before, the importance is you want to create pretty much the duplicate of your pattern piece, but in fabric. So you want to be very thorough in your cutting, and for me, rotary cutter is just that. So moving on, also, I want to demonstrate the importance of basting. And a lot of people definitely, they kind of get around it. More people are concerned about sewing and putting, fabric together, or, of course, combining them. They don't stop to think about intermediate steps they could take to ensure success as they move towards sewing. For a lot of people, basting might be a waste of time, but, it's funny, and I've talked with Mr. Jim about it. Basting is actually something we do a lot of. For me, it's probably a smart use of time. So it is definitely a training wheel kind of tip, but outside of that, I think it should be just kind of like a lifelong embrace practice to do so, just to ensure that you do things correctly. So the reason I'm suggesting basting is, again, I have two different fabrics here, and this is a specific time when I actually do baste. So I have two different fabrics here. They're both knits. Normally I would cut them out separately. Say if I was doing a gown, I'd have all the pattern pieces. They would be done separately. And then I would go to combine each piece before actually assembling the gown. So if it's a gown that has an overlay, like that's actually going to be melded to the fabric, I usually baste those in place. I will never, I repeat, never go to a sewing machine and actually sew this down. Now, there's a lot of reasons why. Specifically when it comes to knits, they stretch. So if you think about this is stretching all different directions. I mean, there's a lot of potential for shifting, getting things out of alignment. The easiest way to control this fabric and at the same time put it together is consider hand basting. So with basting, it's pretty simple. You don't really need many tools. Here's a example of basting thread. You can actually buy it. It actually says basting thread. It's really thick and it's kind of wiry and it doesn't tangle, which is great. So I use this for the most part. You can use regular thread and use, your basic wax and of course iron it to get that permeated into the thread. I also love Thread Heaven. This is like the little small thread conditioner. It's really, great to use. Mine's is a bit overused. It has glitter and everything in it. And I swear this stuff lasts forever. I think I've had this little guy for about 5 years. They sell these now where you can actually attach them to your sewing machine. It's kind of funny. Don't tell anybody I told you this, but they sell them for about $9 just because it attaches to your sewing machine and it's actually smaller. I would say just go get your regular size one, which will run you about $4 or $5. Use your Joann's coupon, and then doggone it, just take some tape and attach it to your sewing machine if you need it there. It'll save you a bit of money. But this is really, really great. If you've never seen this used, it's essentially just taking this little pot. It has kind of like I would equate it to, it has like a feel like lanolin or, it's kind of hard to explain. It's like a non-waxy substance, so it doesn't leave a residue, but you just kind of run your thread through it. So you'll put your thread there, usually your thumb over it, and then just run it through, just like you do with basic wax. Anyhow, this works great with regular thread and making it tangle proof. But again, I like to go straight for just using your basic basting thread. And if you're doing permanent stitching, of course, there's your silicone wax thread, which is your basic strong thread with a waxy coat surface that you can actually use to sew in things like sleeves or whatever you do hand stitching. But this is basting. So I'm going to cut off a little bit and just do a quick little demo of how I do my basting. So we have this thread here. And this is, so let's talk needles. So when it comes down to needles and hand sewing, you can use a wide array of like millinery needles. This is actually Mr. Jim's little needle set. I usually use like a size 9, but this is a range from 3 to 9, 3 being the larger size needle, and then the bigger number is actually the smaller size needle, and it's thinner. So I grabbed kind of one of the thicker needles. It's probably close to 3, 4, 5, something of that sort. So anyway, there's no science to it. Just grab a good sturdy needle. You want to, of course, thread it. And for basting, I know I really don't even sometimes knot the edge in or anything. This is just all quick method just to hold it into place. And sometimes I'll just double back and do like a locking stitch. But essentially when you baste, you want to make sure your stuff doesn't shift. So at this point, I sometimes will throw pins in just to ensure that there's no shifting going on. And then just go for it, go baste. So we got our edges here. I'll kind of, now this knit is a little bit of a feisty one. I can feel that the elastic in it is kind of giving me a little headache and trying to push it through. But see how I just did kind of a smaller stitch just to lock it? So there's that. And then for me, I just put it down. I do not mess with things. That's the problem. Sometimes we fuss with things a little bit too much. I kind of put it down and then just work it. So again, this one has elastic in it. So there we go. You gotta do a little push and then just pull through. All the while adjusting as I go. And I'm sorry, the fabric on top. How about we flip this over so for better visibility? There we go. Let's try that. You can see the white stitch better. So make sure everything is aligned. And then I do baste within the seam allowance itself. So when I go to sew, and then you can do multiple stitches, of course, like that. So then when I actually go to sew it, it's caught in the seam allowance. It's not a problem later on. So I just pull. And there you go. This is basting in action. And again, every gown that I've done that's had double fabric layers, once you do this, you can handle the fabric as one solid piece, and then you can actually go ahead and attach it to all the other pieces. And what this also prevents, which is great, the worst thing in my mind, I promise I would have nightmares about this if it happens, is when you improperly attach two pieces of fabric and you end up with a bubbling. So something like this that happens. Let me give you an example. So you thought you did it by machine, it pulled and it contorted, and then in the end when you go to put that piece together, you see you have some kind of bubble. Well, don't you think when your client, well, in my case, when your client wears something like this, you'll have this, and it's totally irregularity that should not be there. So by definitely taking the time to baste everything down, such as you see here, it keeps everything even, level, and then you can assemble without any problems, which is a good thing. So that's my suggestions as far as cutting and basting your work together. Definitely might not be the best time saver for some people, but in my opinion, and I think Mr. Jim and I discussed, it's always a time saver when you do things kind of correctly, take the time to do it well, and save your time, save yourself the headache of having to go back and pick out stitches later on. So definitely a worthy investment of time. So another great tip is, and it's not necessarily a training wheel, a sewing training wheel tip, so to speak, but I think it's a general overall good practice, and that is to use stabilizers when sewing. So of course when you cut fabric, it has a tendency of moving and shifting and doing other things. Well, stabilizers help to keep key areas in place so you don't have those kind of problems. Here I have two different types that I actually like to use, one more so than the other. This is clear elastic, so it's the lightweight stuff, and here's what it looks like. Completely clear, and it stretches, but as you can see, it's not an out of control stretch, so it actually has there's a little bit of tension there. This is really great, especially since I sew knits, and a lot of people actually use this in sewing, I think, swimwear, but I use it actually in stabilizing the shoulders of most of the knitwear that I make. So, and I'll show you what that looks like. This is a little cute peplum top I made years ago. It's my baby. She's a little worn out. She's definitely worn a lot. But this is the shoulder seam. So as you can see, there is some of this clear elastic in there. So the way I put it in is pretty simple. When I go to attach the front and the back piece together, and then of course it's like this when you go to attach it, this edge, mind you, has been serged, so the seam allowance has been cut off. But let's pretend for the sake of demonstration it's there. Well, what I do normally is I'll attach the front and the back. This elastic needs to be attached to the front, especially if you're going to press that seam back. Otherwise, you'll have an issue because it is a little bit dense that it'll make it problematic. Now I'm going to fold it to the front. See how that's hard? It won't stay down. So you definitely want to put it on the front seam and add it, and then of course press back and it'll lay down for you. But anyhow, so I will take some clear elastic, and I usually will just baste it on where the seam allowance is. And then when I have it in place the way I want it, because sometimes it does travel and get away from you when you're trying to sew with it. So I'll baste it on first, and then I'll go to my serger and then serge off the seam line essentially. And of course that encapsulates this elastic right here. And then notice when I stretch it, that doesn't stretch out, and that's your shoulder area, because you don't want your straps falling off your shoulder. You don't want this contorting. And notice that this fabric really stretches. See that? But with the aid of this product, it actually maintains its shape. So that's really good there. You can also use a stay tape. They actually sell those. Dress makes that product, and as you can see, it's actually a little picture depicting that. This is a little bit different. It's made out of 100% nylon. You can unroll that and see, you can see through it, and it's very stable. This is actually really good also when you want to stabilize a zipper that you're adding to a garment, especially if the fabric kind of moves and shifts, or if you're using something that might be a four-way stretch. This is the little this is the little cutout Mr. Jim used earlier that he was doing his zipper tutorial on. I'm going to show this in action. So here it is. So what you would do here is just pull it out, and wherever your zipper needs to go and be placed, that seam allowance, just make sure this is within that, and you can baste it down and then go back and add your zipper. And as you can see, with this on top of your fabric, your zipper will not shift at all. So that's a really good tip for stabilizing. Also, you can use the seams grate around neckline edges, things like that. I've actually used the clear elastic when I do make knit dresses, especially like a V-neck. I'll slide it into the front V-neck area and then, fold it down under the seam allowance. And if I use my cover stitch machine to actually cover stitch that down, that stabilizes your neckline area so you don't get any gapping, which is always horrific to have a gapping neckline. Another tip is, as far as placing stuff, why not make it easy on yourself? The worst thing is sometimes you're placing a pocket or even a zipper. Try using double-sided basting tape. Now, you notice my package is unopened because I have not used the double-sided basting tape because I'm mainly a baster. I'll baste by hand, baste by machine, but I kind of keep this on hand just in case. And this was a new product, and I am a bit of a product. I was going to use another word, but I like to just try everything. So I thought to pick this up anyway. So anyhow, this is really great if you do want to place down pockets and make sure that they're placed where you want them before you actually sew them on. It's great for zippers. It's great for pretty much placing down anything. And this one's a little bit different than most that you'll buy. You can actually, according to the instructions, you can actually sew through it and it doesn't have to be removed. A lot of times, it never made sense to me. Some say, oh, you really can't sew through it. Well, I'm like, well, what's the point of putting it down if you can't sew through it? Anyhow, that's neither here or there, but this is a great tip for that. And then we're going to move on to just some tips on how to properly sew long seams so you can keep the edges even. So we're going to do that right now.
Okay, people. I'm going to give you a tip on an area that goes wrong for a lot of people. When they sew two pieces together, fronts and back or side seams together, and they start stitching along, and they start stitching along, and they start stitching along, and they get to the bottom of a garment, and all of a sudden, one is longer than the other. Well, there's a reason for that. On your sewing machine, you have two basic components, the presser foot and the teeth, of which we call feed dog. This is why that unevenness happens a lot of times, especially in looser weave knit fabrics. Well, what happens is the presser foot pushes the garment this way. The feed dog pulls it that way. So you have a combination of not them both moving simultaneously. One is moving this way, the other is pulling back that way. So what happens is the top layer gets pushed, the bottom layer gets pulled. The way I do it is I'll stitch my garment down from where I start, and I'll stitch it down almost half the distance. And then I'll stop and I'll look at the garment and see how much, if any, of that is shifting. Now, if for argument's sake, because a lot of time when you serge a garment, the serge kind of pulls it together. If it's finishing, I'll just use these two. If it's finishing where it's short, like that, I'll continue to sew forward, because what's happening is the presser foot is pushing it this way, the underside, the feed dog, is pulling it that way. If it's longer, when I flip it over, and the top part is longer, and I stop wherever I stopped, and I'll flip it over, I'll even these up, even them up again, and I'll start stitching on the reverse side. Now what's happening is the feed dog is pulling the shorter one, although I've evened them up, is starting to push it this way, and the feed dog is starting to pull it that way. So by the time I get to the area in question, the excess will be pushed or pulled in whatever distance that it is. Now sometimes when you shift it over to get these two even, now all of a sudden you might get an excess on the top part. Turn it over again and shift it down so that it works itself into the same area. But this is very common when people are stitching. If they stitch it all the way down, they get to the bottom, and all of a sudden, there it is, one's longer than the other. Just flip the garment over, even it up again, and start sewing. And that is caused mainly because the presser foot is pushing, the feed dog is pulling. So you're getting an uneven balance of shift where one starts to go down this way. If that's the case, flip it over, even them up, and now you'll get the same thing happening on that side. That is something that people always tell me. What they do is they finish sewing the garment and then they cut the bottom off. Well, guess what? You're not balancing now the flow of the grain. When you cut it off, you've tilted it. Just turn it over and start on the other side. That's a common thing that a lot of people get, and they always wonder why.
Okay,
That's
I want
it.
to second Mr. Jim's suggestion on how to deal with wayward, uneven seams. I have a slight variation of his technique. His technique is exceptional, where he takes it and sews partly, evaluates the bottom to see if they're even. If they're not even, of course, flips the whole thing over, evens them, and then feeds through. Well, my method is a little bit different. It doesn't involve flipping over the fabric, so to speak, but it does involve manipulating the fabric to help feed in that extra fabric. Let me show you how I can take that extra fabric at the bottom and feed it so it helps to even up with the top fabric. So for this demonstration, let me just simulate sewing. So if you're sewing your pants leg, skirt, side, whatever it is, you're sewing along, and then you get down, of course. So while I'm sewing, I'm always evaluating the edges of my fabric to make sure, of course, they're not only even, but they're also even at the bottom, which is their whole point, to make sure everything is sewn evenly together. Let me just even this up real quick. So, of course, as I'm sewing along, if I get halfway through, I definitely will do kind of a bottom check. And if I do notice that that bottom is a little bit too long and that top is short like this, my method's a little different. I will grab these two, make them even, and change my hand position with the sewing. So let me put this pressure foot down to kind of give you an idea. So if that is off, I'll even them, and what I'll do is, instead of feeding my fabric straight like this, I'll actually raise my fabric. I actually learned this from watching someone, and what that does is, and I'll kind of hold a little bit firmer to the top versus the bottom. So if there's a little bit extra, what that does is I'm using the feed dogs to help kind of ease this extra fabric in at the bottom. So as you're feeding it along, this change in angle will help to kind of just do a little bit of a ease stitch there. So if you have that extra gaping here, it'll just gently feed in with the top. So that's my slight variation of Mr. Jim's. He takes this off and flip it over. I just kind of give mine a little bit of an incline. Now, mind you, the one thing to consider is you definitely want to check this out before you get too close to the bottom, because if you are at the bottom, it really won't work. You definitely need a little bit of length. So my recommendation to his is always to be checking where your fabric is at the bottom and make sure it's even. If it's off, not even, then you can use one of our two methods and just to get it back even. Simple as that.
Now I showed you guys how at times when this comes down and one is longer than the other, how I take it and I turn it over and start on this side. Another method that I use at times, and all of this depends on the flex of the material. Is it a loose weave or if it's not? So this is what happens. You get this slack in here. Now what I do is I will take it with the needle down and I will pull some stretch right there, and then I'll release it and let the stretch and the stitch work itself out. If it's still some, I'll take it and I'll pull the top one. I'm stretching the top one, not the bottom one. Then when I put this down and kind of get up off of it a little, it's a little softer under the bottom. And now what happens now, the feed dog, like I say, is pushing the fabric down and the teeth are eating up that excess. So I'll do that to check again to see where I am. And that's what I want to do. Then if I get it at a certain position, I'll hold this down and I'll hold the two of them together and finish up my stitch So I'll come
Well,
to my
gang,
end.
we had a great time showing you guys our tips,
Sure did.
methods,
That's right.
the training wheels. I think I'm gonna get me a new bicycle and put some training wheels on it just to remember when. How about you?
You know, and that's funny. Actually, I have a mental picture now. That would be funny. And what we want you to feel is that don't ever feel bad for having to need those steps. You know, a lot of people have a negative feeling about training wheels. No, not at all. It's a means to another end. So definitely use those and those other tips we covered with. Just be happy about that.
Sure should. Sure should. Hey, aren't we having a giveaway coming up too?
We are indeed.
Tell them about that.
Okay, so our giveaway, when you see this show, it'll air on the 10th. So definitely stay tuned for that. We will actually list all the names of every winner. So you want to go ahead and just watch that. This show, of course, airs on Tuesday, but we will air that show on Thursday, September 10th. So yeah.
Okay,
So stay
okay.
tuned for that.
All right. Well, we do thank you once again, Gentleman Jim McFarland, the tailor,
Victoria Baylor, your dressmaker.
and we look forward to seeing you guys again. Actually, you see us.
Absolutely. Until the day we all can get together. Hopefully we'll
Absolutely.
make that happen. But
And we're going to make some things happen so that you'll understand. In the near future, we're going to make some real things happen where we can get together and do some hands-on things.
that's right.
Stay tuned and you'll find out about those.
Absolutely. And of course, stay tuned September 10th for those giveaway winners. And we will see you at the following episode where we'll talk about all things coats and getting your wardrobe ready for the fall.
Sure will.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye.